Today's daf is Menachos daf Tzadik Vav, and we are at the Mishnah, 5 lines from the top of daf Tzadik Vav Amid Al. Zok the Mishnah, Chavite Kohen Gadol, the Minchas Chavitin that the Kohen Gadol used to bring every day, Machtzisa Baboiker, half in the morning, Umachtzisa Ba'erev, and half in the evening, Lishasan, Va'arichasan, in other words, in the previous Mishnah, we had a three-way machloikis, the Tanakama, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, exactly where the shtei halechem and the lechem apanim were prepared. Did they have to be prepared in a klishares inside the azara, or were they dafka prepared outside of the azara? Says the Mishnah, that machloikis is only with regards to the shtei halechem and the lechem apanim. But as it relates to the minchas chavitin, everybody agrees. Lishasan, the kneading, va'arichasan, the forming, va'afiyasan, and the baking, all had to be done inside the azara. Additionally, v'doiches es haShabbos, the doiches Shabbos, pchinasan, v'har kadasan, stating that, but grinding the wheat to have the flour for the minchas chavitin, v'har kadasan, or sifting it, which also involved Melecha Shabbos, Toichen and Meraked respectively, Einan Doiches es HaShabbos. They're not Doiches Shabbos. Why? Klal Omer Rabbi Akiva. This is one of the many places in Shas where the Gemara quotes Rabbi Akiva, who said, Kol Melacha She'efshal Asayis Erev Shabbos, Einan Doiches HaShabbos. Any Melacha that can be done before Shabbos is not Doiches Shabbos. It's only the She'ef Shal Asayis Erev Shabbos, a Melacha that cannot be done before Shabbos, it's then that's Doiches HaShabbos. So although it's true the Minchas Chavitin technically was Doiches Shabbos, but only aspects of it that had to be done on Shabbos. So for example, the Lisha, the Aricha, and the Afiyah had to be done on Shabbos. Why? Because being that they were done on the Klisharis, had to be done Erev Shabbos, they would have became Pasal Belina. But the Toichin and the Merakid, which did not have to be done on Shabbos, will not be Doiches Shabbos. So this is even though the Minchas Chavitin is Doiches Shabbos. But Rabbi Akiva's Shita is only the components that have to be done on Shabbos. But the components that do not have to be done on Shabbos will not be Doiches Shabbos. Where else does Rabbi Akiva come up in Shas? In Perek Rabbi Eliezer de Mila. Mila is Doiches Shabbos. But Rabbi Akiva says only parts of Mila that have to be done Bismanai. So for example, whereas Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're allowed to cut a branch to make a knife on Shabbos, Rabbi Akiva says no, that's something that you could have done on Erev Shabbos. Mila itself, which has to be done by Yom HaShmini, so that's a dover she'ef shal asoyis erev Shabbos. That's going to be Doiches Shabbos. But any component of a malacha that's Doiches Shabbos, if that particular component could have been done before Shabbos, the halacha is it's not Doiches Shabbos. Another halacha, kol menachos, all menachos, meaning not the shtei halechem, the lechem apanim, not even the minchas chavitin, but your typical ordinary mincha. The halacha is yesh behem ma'isa kli b'fnim, ve'ein behem ma'isa kli b'chutz. They had to be done in a klisharis, all the preparation, and it had to be done b'ifnim. Shtei halechem, another halacha, arkon shiva tfachim. It was 7 tfachim long, each one of the breads. V'rachban dalet tfachim. They were 4 tfachim wide. V'karnoiseha arba etzbais, and they had corners. We'll see more about that in the Gemara. And each corner, 4 corners, were 4 etzbais. So it was 7 tfachim long by 4 tfachim wide. Plus there were 4 corners, each one was 4 etzbais. Lechem apanim archon yud was 10 tfachim long. V'rachban 8 tfachim, 5 tfachim wide. V'karnoisa, they too had corners, and the corners were 7 etzbais, they were 7 etzbais. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shaloi tita, a good way to remember. So Rabbi Yehuda hayonoisim behem simanim. What were the simanim? Zadad, Yahaz. Zadad is the shtei halechem. Zayin, 7 tfachim long. Dalid, 4 tfachim wide, and dalit, each one of the karnos, each one of the corners were 4 etzbais. As it relates to the second siman, that's referring to the lechem apanim. It was yud hey. It was 10 long by 5 wide, and the zayin was also referring to the corners. Each one was 7 tfachim. So this is clearly Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasei. Rabbi Yehuda in the Gadash al Pesach was hayonoisim hem simanim the tzach hadash biachav. So clearly there wasn't a one-off Rabbi Yehuda where one time Rabbi Yehuda was noisim hem simanim. But this clearly was minhagay shel Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda here too gave simanim zadad. Yahaz ben Zayme. Ben Zayme says v'nesata al shulchan lechem panim lefanai tam. The Torah refers to the lechem as lechem apanim. So why is it called lechem apanim? Says ben Zayme lechem panim sheyiu loy panim. Pashut, it sounds like it should have panim. It should have a face. So Rashi says 2 pshatim what that means. One pshat Rashi says defanos. we're going to see later in the Mishnah that the way the lechem hapanim were made, they were folded over. So if you've seen a picture of lechem hapanim, you know they had two walls on the two sides of the lechem hapanim. So those two walls, the defanos is the panim. Lishna achrina, another pshat, Rashi says, sheyeheloi pinim. It's not lechem hapanim, it's lechem hapinim. Sheyeheloi pinim zaviyos. It had corners. Vehein hein akronis. Those are the corners that the Mishnah just referred to. Hashulchan archa yud v'rachmei chamisha. The shulchan was 10 tfachim long by 5 tfachim wide. Lechem hapanim archa yud v'rachmei hey. The lechem hapanim was also 10 tfachim long by 5 tfachim wide. Now, the lechem hapanim were set up. It was yud beis chalois, and there were 2 marachas. There were 2 piles. Each one had 6. Now, if the lechem hapanim had the same dimensions as the shulchan is 10 by 5, and each one of the breads is 10 by 5, so how in the world are you going to have 2 piles of lechem hapanim? 1 pile you could have. The lechem hapanim is the exact same size as the shulchan. So it says the Mishnah, the way it was done was noisen archai keneged rachbei shel shulchan. You took the length of the lechem hapanim, which is 10 tfachim, and you put it along the width of the shulchan, which was 5 tfachim. But that doesn't work because the length of the lechem hapanim is twice the size as the width of the shulchan. So here's the punchline: you created 2 walls on the lechem hapanim. Each wall was 2.5 tfachim. If each wall is 2.5 tfachim, so now the length of the lechem hapanim after you created these 2 walls, these 2 folds, so now it was only 5 tfachim. So what you did is you made from the lechem hapanim, which was really 10 by 5. A bread that was 5 by 5, by virtue of the fact that the 10 turned into 5, because now you have 2 walls, each one is 2.5 tvachim. 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5, so 10 minus the 2.5s, you're left with 5 by 5. So you can line up the 2 5 by 5s on the shulchan, which is 10 by 5. And the way you do that is by aligning the length of the lechem hapanim, which is now 5, along the width of the shulchan, which is also 5. Either way, nimtza, says the Mishnah, archai memala rachbei shel shulchan. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Azayat Rabbi Yehuda. Meir says, hashulchan archa yud beis v'rachbei vav. The shulchan had different dimensions. It was not 10 by 5, but rather it was 12 by 6. Lechem hapanim archa yud v'rachbei hey. Meir doesn't argue with regards to the dimensions of the lechem hapanim. So the shulchan was 12 by 6, the lechem hapanim was 10 by 5. So how did you fit the 2 rows of lechem hapanims on the shulchan? Again, you took the length of the lechem hapanim, which is 12, and you aligned it with the width of the shulchan, which was 5. The way to do that would be by being koifel tfachayim mikan utfachayim mikan. So instead of making walls that are 2.5 each, the walls were only 2 each. Thus, the lechem hapanim went from being 10 by 5 to 6 by 5, because each one of the breads has 2 walls. Each wall is tfachayim, it's 2 tefachs. So it's 10 minus 2 minus 2. So now you end up with 6 by 5. That has to be lined up with the shulchan, which is 12 by 6. And the way it was lined up was, now you're going to have the 6 is lined up against the 6 because the length of the lechem hapanim is against the width of the shulchan, and you're going to end up with 2 tfachim in between the 2 breads. Now, what was the purpose of having the 2 tfachim in between the 2 breads? Like this, the wind will be able to blow. You want separation between the piles of breads, because otherwise it can make the bread spoil. Abishal says, it wasn't just there so that there could be ear, there could be room there, but rather the purpose of it was to be able to put the shnei bezichel levayna. So they told Abishal, is that where you put the shnei bezichel levayna? Doesn't the pasuk say that the 2 bezichel levayna was supposed to be on the top of the 2 marachos, on top of the actual breads? It's true, it says v'nasata ala mareches levayna zaka, but arei kfar nema, there's another pasuk that says v'olav mate Menashe, that Ephraim was on Menashe. Is that what it means? That Shevet Ephraim was olav literally on Menashe? No, what it means is next to Menashe. So too when it says v'nasata ala mareches levayna, it doesn't mean literally on the maracha, but rather what it means is next to the maracha. So either way, the Mishnah Mishnah saying a chiddush with regards to the lechem hapanim that the breads had to be folded, and the reason they had to be folded was because they had to have these two marachos, these two piles of breads. They had to somehow fit on the shulchan, and there was no way to get it to fit on the shulchan. And although there's a machlokes remain Rabbi Yehuda exactly what the dimensions of the shulchan were, was the shulchan 10 by 5 or was the shulchan 12 by 6? But regardless, the lechem hapanim was definitely 10 by 5, and there's no way to get two breads that are 10 by 5 to fit on a shulchan that's either 10 by 5 or 12 by 6. So you were mukhrach, you had absolutely no choice but to fold the breads. How much were they folded? According to Rabbi Yehuda, there were two walls. Each wall was 2.5 tvachim. According to Rabbi Meir, there were two walls. Each wall was 2 tvachim. Incidentally, how's it possible that this machlekes Rabbi and Rabbi Yehuda regarding the dimensions of the shulchan? Isn't a psukim in the Torah? Amosayim arkoi, v'amarachboi. Right, it's mefurish in the Torah exactly what it was supposed to be. So the Gemara is going to discuss it in the next staff, and the Gemara is going to say it's really totally in a bigger machlekes whether all the amos that are mentioned in the context of the Mishkan, were they amos that are made up of 6 tvachim or amos that are made up of 5 tvachim? So ordinarily an amma is made up of 6 tvachim. But there is a shita, and that is Rabbi Yehuda's shita in our Mishnah, that the amos of the Mishkan were not made up of 6 tvachim, rather they were made up of 5 tvachim. So if the shulchan was 2 amos long, it's not 2 times 6, it's 2 times 5. Thus it's 10 tvachim. And if it was 1 amma wide, it's not 6 tvachim, but rather it's 5 tvachim. Either way, the Mishnah continues and says, Varbos snifin shalzav hayusham, there were 4 pillars. We spoke about this previously. They were made up of gold, and their job was to support the breads. They stood alongside the shulchan. They supported the breads. Mefutzalim mirasheim, and there were little pegs that were pointing out the sides of these boards. Shahayu saimcha behem shnayim l'sei dezeh v'shnayim l'sei dezeh, and the purpose of these boards were to lean on the breads to keep them whole. V'chav ches kanim, and there were 28 little rods. Kechatzi kana, it was really half rods. Chalul, they were hollow. The purpose of them were 14 for one set of 6 breads, and the 14 for the other set of 6 breads. And they separated each row. And the reason they were the snifim, were mefutzalim, the reason they had these pegs was to support these kanim that were going to be in between the rows of bread. More about this again in the next stuff. The Mishnah continues and says, Loi sidur kanim v'loi netilas deiches haShabbos. That although so much of the Menachos and so much of what went on in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash was deiches Shabbos, but as it relates to taking these kanim in and out of the shulchan itself, they weren't deiches Shabbos. Now that's a problem, because when was the lechem hapanim removed and placed on the shulchan? It was all done on Shabbos. So if it was all done on Shabbos, and you can't remove the kanim or place the kanim on the bread, and you can't touch the kanim on Shabbos, so what did you do? So the Mishnah says, the kanim were removed on Erev Shabbos, they're put next to the shulchan, and then on the day after Shabbos, on Sunday, they would go and they would put it back again. So as much as the kanim were there and they played an important role, we'll see that the psukim in the Torah that talk about these kanim, but at the same time, there was a short period of time where there were no kanim. Because being that the lechem hapanim were going to have to be played with, removed, and placed on Shabbos, and on Shabbos, you can't touch these kanim, they're off limits, so you were mukhrach to remove the kanim, even though the breads are still going to be in the lechem hapanim Erev Shabbos, and you couldn't put them back on until Shabbos. One final halacha: kol hakelim l'shayim b'mikdash, arkan l'arka shavayis. All the kelim on the mikdash, the way they were situated was along the length of the oyel ma'id. Either way, a long Mishnah. There were a lot of halachas in the Mishnah, and now the Gemara is going to dissect it case by case. Zok the Gemara, all the menachos had to be prepared in a venix, even though the shtei lechem and the lechem hapanim, it's a machlekes, Tanakama, Rabbi Yehuda, exactly where they were prepared inside or were they prepared outside. But as it relates to the typical mincha, kol menachos ma'isa keli b'bifnim. Zok the Gemara shalus Rabbi Zuminai. So they asked Rabbi, how do you know this? What's the makar? It's not a pasuk in the Torah. Amal Lehem, so he told him, although it's true, it's not in the Torah anywhere, but Arei Oimer, it's a pasuk in Yecheskel. Yecheskel, of course, said nevuah about Bayis Shlishi, and one of the things Yecheskel was shown about Bayis Shlishi is Vayoimer Elai Zeh HaMakom. He saw the place Asher Yevashlu Sham HaKohanim, where the Kohanim were cooking as a chatas v'esa asha, and then he saw the place Asher Yoifu as a mincha. He saw the place where the Kohanim were baking the mincha. Levilti hoitzi el hachatzer hachitzaina, and it was very clear that the mincha and the chatas and the asham were not allowed to be removed from the chatzar. Says the Gemara, mincha dum yad asham v'chatas. The pasuk equates the cooking of the chatas and the asham to the baking of the mincha. Ma asham v'chatas tunan kli. Just like the asham and the chatas require a kli shares, they had to be done dafka inside. Af mincha nami tuna kli. So to the mincha had to be baked inside. And even though this is referring to the baking, but Chazal understood. Rebbe said this is the makar that all the preparations of the mincha had to be done inside. According to the Manda Amar that says Rabbi Yehuda that the walls of the lechem aponim were 2.5 tvachim each. Nimtza shulchan mekadesh chamisa tvachim l'mayl. It comes out that the shulchan was mekadesh 15 tvachim high. How so? Because there were 6 breads that were all getting kedusha from the shulchan. Even had the shnei bezichei levoina, according to one man the Amar, on top of the breads. So you had the 6 breads. 6 times 2.5 is 15. L'divrei ha'omer tfachayim. According to Manama, that says that each one of the walls was 2 tvachim. Nimtza shulchan mekadesh yud beis tvachim. So it's not 6 times 2.5, but rather it's 6 times 2. And as a result, what you had was 12 tvachim. Frek the Gemara, is it only 15 tvachim or is it only 12 tvachim? Va'ika kanim. What about the poles, those pegs that were in between the rows of breads? Didn't they take up space? So the Gemara says, Shekui meshakelohom. They didn't take up any space because they sunk into the breads. So as a result, they didn't take up any added space. My time afraid the Gemara, I don't understand. Isn't the whole point of the kanim to separate between the breads? There should be rows, like trays of breads. You don't put one chal on top of another, you separate them with a row. So that if that's the whole point, and you tell me now that they sunk in, they didn't even take up any physical space, so it sort of defeats the purpose. So why did we even have them for? Straight to Gemara, soif kamiyafish lachem de migaba. Isn't it defeat the purpose? So the Gemara says, you're right, the Magbele ported. No, there was a little bit of space. That little bit of space prevented it from spoiling. Okay, namarav shachet, there's a little bit of space, so then it's not just 12 tfachim or 15 tfachim that the shulchan's being mekadesh. The shulchan's really being mekadesh more than that. So the Gemara says, kivin havi tefach, being that little bit of space that the kanim took up were less than a tefach, it's not considered chashiv, and it doesn't go into the equation. Meaning, in reality, it's true. The shulchan was mekadesh more than 12 tfachim and 15 tfachim, respectively, according to Rameh and Rabbi Yehuda. The reason we mentioned 12 and 15 and not more, because that little bit of more is insignificant, it's an immaterial number, and as a result, it wasn't mentioned. What about the bezichei levaina, that pashup shat were on top of the breads? The shulchan was mekadesh that, the bezichei levaina took up space, so the Gemara says, begavi delechem aviyasvi, they were inside the breads. What does it mean inside the breads? Because the breads had walls. Right? So the walls were 2.5 tfachim or 2 tfachim. The bezichei levaina was sitting inside the actual bread. Freit the Gemara. What about the corners? The Mishnah mentioned that the lechem haponim had to have corners, 7 etzba'is. So l'chura, those corners, 7 etzba'is times 6, that's going to take up a lot of space. So the Gemara says, corners legave the lechem kayef lahu. V'lechem alayu nachle. The way the corners were, they weren't pointing upwards. They were actually pointing inwards. So if you have a picture, you could refer to the picture. But it's not like the corners that were on the shulchan, that were on the mizbeach, that were pointing upwards. They weren't up, they were pointing in. As a result, from a height perspective, they didn't add any height to the breads. So the height of the breads remained 2.5 tfachim or 2 tfachim. What about the miskeres? So the miskeres was a frame that the shulchan had. The Torah talks about the miskeres, and the Torah says that the miskeres was a tefach. So it's another tefach. You had the miskeres, a pashut. You understand that the frame, the makshan, the Gemara is understanding, it added a tefach of height to the shulchan. So again, the shulchan's being mekadesh, the miskeres, plus all the bread. So it's not 12 tfachim or 15 tfachim, it's 13 tfachim or 16 tfachim. So the Gemara says, Commando Amar, this sugi is going like the Manda that holds Meskarte Lamata. So it's really machlokes whether the Meskeres was Lamaila or the Meskeres was Lamata. This Gemara is going that the Meskeres was Lamata. If it was Lamata, then it's underneath the shulchan. We're talking about how high the shulchan was mekadesh. According to the Manda Amma that goes, holds that it was lamayla. So what's he gonna say? Says the Gemara, Kudei have a mifrakta, v'lechem begabe the shulchan have a yosef. You have to say that the miskeres was a border. That's what it was. Meaning it didn't take up the entire space of the table, the entire space of the shulchan, but rather it was more of a border, and the border was facing out. A praktan is somebody that's leaning back. So it was leaning back. The point is you were able to put the breads on the shulchan without it going on the miskeres. So the miskeres was there, but it was more of an outside frame. It didn't add any height to the breads because it was bending backwards, so to speak. It was on the outside. Thus, the breads were not on top of the miskeres, adding another tefach to how high the shulchan was being mekadesh, but rather the breads were directly on the shulchan. And the Gemara says, Kidetanya, it's a mefurish brayso. Rabbi Yosef says, Lahoya shom snifen, ela miskarto shel shulchan, mamedes es halechem. Amrullah, they told him, miskarto lamata haisa. Bottom line is, you see over here that there's a machloikis, whether the miskeres was l'mayla and the miskeres was le-mata. Zakti Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan said another halacha on the topic of the miskeres. But that says that this miskeres was not on top of the shulchan, but rather was on the bottom of the shulchan. Tavla hamisa peches tmeya. It's going to come out that a tavla, literally a tablet, a daf, something that's made out of wood, that only has a chashivus of a keli if it's turned upside down, is going to be Makabel Toma. And really, the background to this halacha is that Pshutei Kli Eitz are not Makabel Toma. There's a Xeris HaKasev that says that wood, although it's Makabel Toma, it's only Makabel Toma if it has a receptacle. If it has a base kibble. But if it's smooth and there's no base kibble, the halacha is it's not Makabel Toma. And we're going to see in a moment that Rabbi Yochanan had a raya that the Shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash was Makabel Toma. And he was bothered. Why was it Makabel Toma? Bishloima, if you hold the miskeres, was Lamaila. So the miskeres created a base kibble. That's the receptacle. The miskeres that's around it. Thus, it's not looked at Pshutei Klietz. And being that it's not looked at as Pshutei Klietz, it makes sense why it's Makabel Toma. But according to Madam, that says the miskeres was Lamata. So where's the base kibble? It's Pshutei Klietz. Why is it Makabel Toma? Says Rabbi Yochanan, you know what you have to say? That being that if you would flip the table upside down, the Maskara says Lamata, it would have a base kibble. Kavlo hamisapeches tameya. The halach is it's going to be tummy. And apparently this was a shaila that Miram weren't really sure of. Said Rabbi Yochanan that from this Gemara I have a raya that a tavla misapeches is Makabel Toma. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan continued and said that if you hold the Maskara was Lamaila, tavla misapeches libayolach. I don't know. I have no hechra, not from here or from anywhere else, whether or not a tavla whose whole chashivos is the fact that it's misapeches would be mekabel toma. But the Gemara says michal the shulchan bar kapulei toma. Clearly, Rabbi Yochanan is implying from his whole shmuz that the shulchan in the Mishkan in the Beis Hamikdash was mekabel toma. The Gemara, why is it so pasha that's mekabel toma? If anything, the Gemara argues I think it shouldn't be mekabel toma. You know why? Because klietza asu lenachasu. Because isn't the shulchan a prototype? Isn't it a classic example of a kli eitz, a keli that's made out of wood, that was asul l'nachas, that's made to stay in one place? And the halach is v'chol kli eitz asul l'nachas, they mekabel toma. Any kli eitz that's asul l'nachas, not mekabel toma. My time you're doing the sack beinon. It's Xeris HaKasev that the only time eitz is mekabel toma if it's similar to a sack. A mas sack metal to molverek, just like a sack is something that people carry, whether it's empty, whether it's full. But the point is, a sack is a dover ha-metaltel. I've come metal to molverek. The only time wood is mekabel toma if it's metaltel. So the Gemara's kash is that Rabbi Yochanan is bothered that how was the shulchan mekabel toma? Where's the base kibble? So he said that if the mascaras was lamayla, I understand, but if the mascaras was lamata, l'chura doesn't have a base kibble, and Rabbi Yochanan wanted to be mechadish. That you see from here that Kavla hamishapeches is mekabel toma. But the Gemara says, 1 second, you want the shulchan to be mekabel toma? Forget about whether it has a base kibble or not. It's anyways not mekabel toma because it's asui lenachas. And there's another rule in Hilchas Tuma V'Taira that wood is only mekabel toma if it's metaltel dum yudesak beinon. But being that the shulchan wasn't a dover hametaltel, so isn't it obvious anyways that it wasn't mekabel toma? Says the Gemara, it's not true. The shulchan really was a dover hametaltel. Incidentally, Tosfos asks, in light of the raid that we spoke about this morning, the shulchan wasn't mekabel toma?
It wasn't a davar hametaltel. They used to travel. Vayhi ben Soya hashulchan. Right? The shulchan used to travel. We saw psukim in Parshas Bamidbar Kasha. Yachanu came. You saw that was the first Gemara on Daf Tzadik Hey, where the Gemara discussed the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi while the shulchan was traveling, whether the lechem upon him that was on the shulchan was it possible b'yotzei, or did it not become possible b'yotzei? Either way, Tosfos asks the kasha. It's a one-line Tosfos. Tosfos has a teretz here. Tosfos and the Masechtas Chagigas has another teretz. But regardless, it's muchach in the Gemara that the fact that the shulchan traveled in the midbar would not be a reason to view it as a davar hametaltel. Thus, the Gemara's kasha. What's Rabbi Yochanan discussing the shulchan being makabel tumah? It's a kliyeta asur lenachas. Says the Gemara, a beautiful teretz. You know what the teretz is? Kedei Reish Lakish. Damar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said a dvar haggadah. Meidach said, what's pshat in the pasuk that says ala shulchan hatahar? So the Torah refers to the shulchan as a shulchan hatahar. Freit the Gemara tahar michlal deikatameh seems to suggest that it's possible for the shulchan to be tameh. So what's the Gemara's kasha? That how would it be tameh? L'chura it's a klietz ha'asu lenachas. Elam alamid Reish Lakish said shemagbi nois regalim that when the Yidden used to be oiler regel, so the kehanim in the Beis Hamikdash would lift up the shulchan and they would show the shulchan to the oiler regalim. What was the purpose? Umar lo lechem. They wanted them to see the bread, and they wanted them to see that the bread remained fresh. Va'oilam they would tell them Ru'uchi baschem lefnei hamakoim, that you see how much Hashem loves you. Look at the miracles that He performs. There was a tremendous miracle that used to happen weekly with the lechem apanim. Si lukai kisidur. Lechem apanim remain on the shulchan for a week. Usually, if you leave bread out for a week, you know what it tastes like. But that wasn't the way it was with the lechem apanim. Shenemar losum lechem cham b'yomi lakchay. Not only was it fresh, it was hot. It was like it came right out of the oven. This is a week later. The bottom line is that you see from here that what? I mean, you see chibaschem l'fnei hamakim, the miracle that happened with the lechem apanim. But that's not what we need for our sugya. What we need for our sugya, what's the punchline? The punchline is you see that they used to carry the shulchan. Because when the Yidden used to be oile regel, they would lift up the shulchan and they would show the oile regel ru'uchi baschem l'fnei hamakim. The fact that it was lifted on Yontif, that's enough that it shouldn't be viewed as a kliyeta asu lenachas. We look at it as a davar metaltel, and it's for that reason it's makabel toma. That's Rabbi Yochanan had a kasha. How's it makabel toma? It's pshutei kliyates. Where's the base kibble? So if the mascaras was the mine, but if the mascaras was that's the discussion of Rabbi Yochanan. The kasha was, isn't this discussion dead on arrival? Because it's anyways kliyeta asu lenachas. The answer is no. Because on Yontif they used to lift up the shulchan, and that made it a davar hametaltel. So before we go weiter, 4 hours. Short hours. The first hour. So we mentioned over here that the shulchan used to be lifted. It was lifted when the Yidden would come to be oiler regel. Remei Simcha in Meshech Chachma makes a beautiful day. We know that the Aron and the shulchan and the mizbeach all had poles, and the purpose of the poles were to carry the respective kelim. Stating that, the Gemara, when it describes the poles and the purpose of it, the Torah I should say, to carry those kelim, the Torah uses a different lashon for the shulchan than it uses for the Aron and the Mizbeach. When the Torah talks about the Aron, the Torah says, Ve'veses habadim tabois al tzalois ha'aron. And what was the purpose of the badim? Loses es ha'aron bahem. The purpose was loses, to carry the Aron. When the Torah talks about the Mizbeach, so the Torah says the Mizbeach had these poles as well. Ushtei tabizov tasale mitachas l'zeir, ushtei loisav tasal shnei tzidav, v'hoya levatim levadim loses oisoi bahem. Again, the purpose of it was to carry it. When the Torah talks about the shulchan, so again, loses. That's the word. When the Torah talks about the shulchan, v'asisa es habadim atzei shitim, v'tzipisa oisam zoha, v'nisavam es ha-shulchan. Torah doesn't use the lashon loses, but rather the Torah uses the lashon v'nisa. It says Remei Simcha in our classic Meshech Chachma. Why does the Torah use the word v'nisa? Why not the word loses? Loses suggests that it's just going to happen. V'nisa is a lashon tzivoy. Thou shalt carry the shulchan. Says Remei Simcha, there was a mitzvah to carry the shulchan. When? Sagt Remei Simcha, Menachos Daf Tzadik Vav Amud Beis. It's also Gemara Chagiga Chavav Amud Beis. The Gemara says when the Yidden came to be Oiler Regel, Melamid Shemagbi and Oisei Loiler Regalim, Umaron Loilechem Va'imrim Lam Ruchi Baschem Lefnei Hamakoim. It wasn't a punct
there was a mitzvah. By the Ara, and it was losses. If you had to carry it, you carried it. By the Mizbeach, it was losses. If you had to carry it, you carry it. But when it comes to the Shulchan, here the Torah says, V'asisa es habadim atzei shitim, v'tzipisa oisam zah, v'nisa v'hemes ha-shulchan. V'nisa is a Lashon Tzivoy, says Ramei Simcha, and as a result, the Torah was Mashad of Lashon with the Shulchan, as versus the way the Torah described it with regards to the other Kalim. That's the first Torah. The second Torah is I saw in the Sefer Megadim Chadashim from David Yoel Weiss. Masechtes Chagiga. Again, this Gemara right here is also Gemara Chagiga Daf Chav Vav Amud Beis. So there's a Sefer Megadim Chadashim Masechtes Chagiga, and over there he has an arichos on this Gemara. And one of the ha'aras that he asks is based on a well-known Shitas Haramban. The Ramban in Parshas Re'eh in two places. So this is Ramban in his Pirush Al Torah twice. Ironically, both times it's in Parshas Re'eh. One time it's in Devarim Perek Yud Beis. The second time it's in Devarim Perek Tezayin. The Ramban says a chiddush. The Ramban says that even though we know the Torah says many times Shalish Pamim Bashana Yeirah Kol Schurchas Pnei Hashem Elokecha, that there was a mitzvah to be Oil Regel. Torah chazes it over again and again and again. Says the Ramban that this mitzvah to be Oil Regel was only once the Yidden came to Eretz Yisrael. But when the Yidden were in the Midbar, even though there was a Mishkan, and when the Yidden came to Eretz Yisrael, even though there was Noiv and Givoin and Shiloi, there was no mitzvah to be Oil Regel. The mitzvah to be Oil Regel, says the Ramban, was Dafka when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael. And the Ramban says it's really meduyik that way in the pasuk. Shalosh pamim bashana yeirah kol zechurcha es pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar b'chag hamatzos v'chag hashvuos v'chag hasukkos. But the Torah says b'makom asher yivchar, and the Ramban is not sure why the Torah said that. His second pshat, says the Ramban, is Oishe Yevar Kanshlo Yischayvu Lalis Regel Adashe Yivchar Hashem Mokoim L'Shich Noisham. Incidentally, so this chiddush is Yodua in the name of the Ramban. There's a Rashi in Parshas Kisiso that's tucked away that not everybody knows. That's one of the places that the Torah talks about the mitzvah to be Oil Regel. So it says Sholish Pamim Bashana Yeirah Kol Schurcha Es Pnei Adain Hashem Elikei Yisrael. And then the very next pasuk is Ki Oirish Goya Mipanecha. You're going to have a lot of land to settle in, the Jews that is. So the Torah is talking about the mitzvah to be Oil Regel. And the Torah throws in an interesting preface. It says the Torah, Ki Oirish Goya Mipanecha, what does that have to do with the mitzvah to be Oil Regel? You're going to have so much place. Wow, the Yidden are going to conquer all this land. You're going to have all this land that you're going to conquer. And then again, you have a mitzvah of Shalish Pamim Bashana to be Oil Regel. Says Rashi that you know why the Torah throw in Verchavti Es Kvulecha? It's the time of the Kra. Why does the mitzvah to be Oil Regel? Verchavti Es Kvulecha Zok Teilig Rashi that to rochik mi Beis Abchira. You're going to be very far from Beis Abchira. Ve'encha Yochal Eira is Lafan Aitavin. And it's going to be very hard for you to come visit on a regular day. You live far away. You live in Bnei Brak. Hey, you're going to go to Yerushalayim. It's not so easy. So the reason there's a mitzvah to be Oil Regel, says Rashi, is ki Irish goyim mipanecha v'irchavti es gvulecha. It's because of the harchavas hagvul. That's precisely for that reason. So when the Yidden were in the Midbar, they didn't have the v'irchavti es gvulecha. So it would make sense based on Rashi, who's explaining literally at time of the crow why there's a mitzvah to be Oil Regel, that it's only related to once the Yidden settled in Eretz Yisrael. So it wouldn't explain why there's no mitzvah to be Oil Regel in Noiv, Givoin, and Shiloi. But Al Kopanim, as relates to being Oil Regel in the Midbar, that you wouldn't have. So based on that, so I saw the Megadim Chadashim, he asks that according to the Ramban, which is really a Rashi also in Parshas Kisisa, that there was no mitzvah to be Oil Regel when the Yidden were in the Mishkan, such a come out in Chesh, that the Shulchan, when it was in the Mishkan, was a Kliyei Tza'asim Menachos. Because you were never metaltal it. Taisus already asked the kasha, what do you mean? You were metaltal the shulchan every time you carried. Vayi ben sayah ha-shulchan. Kasha yachar kains, but Taisus answered. Whatever the teretz is, it's a little unclear. Taisus menachos tzadik vav, Taisus chagiga chavav. There's two teruts into Taisus kasha. But the bottom line is, Taisus was meichiach from the Gemara that that's not enough of a reason to make it a clean. That's also metaltal. The only thing would be the fact that they used to pick it up when the Yidden came to be Oil Regel. The problem is they weren't Oil Regel on the Mishkan. And this pasuk that the Gemara proved
that the Shulchan became Tameh is a pasuk in Vayikra, Perach of Dalet. The Samto Oisem Shtayim Marochi Shesha Marechos Al Shulchan At Tahar Michal Dekatameh. That was the Gemara's deal. So it's interesting that we're dealing with a pasuk that's describing the Shulchan and the Mishkan. That's the Rayetz Mekabel Tumah. And why do we saying it was Mekabel Tumah? Because they were metaltalin. When were they metaltalin? In Shlomo Melech's Beis Hamikdash, L'chur in the Mishkan itself, it was never something that was carried. Thus, it would be a kliyet, so also Menachos, a festa ha'ar. That's the second har. The third har is, we always speak out the Mishnah in the 5th parak in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah talks about the 10 nisim that happen every day in the Beis Hamikdash, or not every day, but constantly in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Mishnah does not mention the fact that the lechem hapanim remained fresh, mishabbos l'shabbos. Not just that, the Rabbeinu Bachya in Parashat Sav, who has his extended version, we also talk about that all the time, of the Yudches Nisim that happened, it's not mentioned there either. So yesh la'ayin, why it's not mentioned? What's particularly interesting is that we mentioned that one of the miracles that happened all the time in the Beis Hamikdash was the Ner Maravi. The Ner Maravi was the last one to be lit, and it was the first one to be lit, it was the last one to extinguish. That was the miracle of the Ner Maravi. What was the purpose, the punchline of the Ner Maravi? The purpose of it was to say Eidos that there was Shechina. This miracle had a different emphasis. The emphasis of this miracle was Ru'uchi Baschem Lefnei HaMakom. So you see that not all miracles were created equally in terms of their purpose. What exactly they're coming to accomplish. There's a miracle like the Ner Maravi. What was the purpose of the Ner Maravi? We were medayik, if you remember the Taisus Yantiv, that it wasn't just that one miracle, but all the miracles that are not mentioned in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the tachlis of was Eidas L'chal B'Yei Olam Sha'ashina She'er B'Yisrael. But the point is, there were miracles, the purpose of which was for us personally to benefit from. There were miracles, the purpose was to say Eidos that the Shechina. And then there's a miracle like this. The purpose of the miracle is Ru'uchi Baschem Lefnei HaMakom. Just one final ara, the fourth ara, and that is, so you see that there was a Nes Gadol, Nasa B'Lechem Aponim, Silukai Kisiduroi, that the Lechem Aponim would remain fresh. Now, one of the integral parts of the Shulchan was you had to have kanim. You had to have these poles, shelves, that separated the bread. What was the point? Shouldn't spoil. If there was a miracle happening anyways, so what's the point in having it? What do you need the kanim for? This is a Nes Gadol. Nes Gadol Hayashab, right? This is a Nes Gadol, Rebbe Shua ben Levi. It's not a small miracle. It's a big miracle. So if this is there was a big miracle, it was a monster miracle happening every day in the Beis Hamikdash. It anyways wasn't spoiling. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to make kanim. What's the point of making kanim? But of course, the answer is the Ramban in Parshas Noach. The Ramban in Parshas Noach asks that if you make a cheshbon and you figure out the dimensions of the teva, and then you factor in that the entire animal kingdom, male and female, plus Noach and the guy and everything fit into this teva, it was all done on Derech Nes. So the Ramban says if it was all done on Derech Nes, then what was the purpose of even having a big teva? Not just that, Chazal say it took Noach 120 years to build a teva. The Im Toimar, freak the Ramban, Yasena Kitano, the Yismach ala Nes. You're anyways being Saimach on a Nes. So what's the point? The Ramban says two teruts. And the first teretz Ramban says is true. That really, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have made a Nes. It should not have taken Noach this long to build a teva. The reason it took him this long is because Hashem wanted people to see Noach building the table. They can ask Noach, what are you doing? Hashem's going to bring a mabel. What's the mabel? One thing is he was hoping, Ula Yasu Tshuva, Lashon HaRamah. He was hoping that maybe Noach would be able to get his generation to do Tshuva. So you're right. Based on the Nes, it shouldn't have been this way. But there was an ulterior motive. But V'oid, says Rambam, but there's another pshat. Also, you want to know why Noach made the teva big? L'ma'it b'nes. Ki chein haderech b'chol hanisim shebetorah u'b'neviim lasleis ma shebiad adam lasleis. A person is supposed to make his shtadl even when it comes to miracles. You do whatever you could do. And even though, what do you mean? I'm relying on a Nes Gadol. So what's the point of my little ishtadlus? Noach's teva was also a Nes Gadol. But at the same time, the Kain Derech B'chol HaNisim Shebetorah Oy B'Neviim Lasleis Ma Shebiad Adam Lasleis. And the Ramban says if you look at every single Nes, the Ramban chooses his words very, very carefully. Ki Kain HaDerech B'chol HaNisim Shebetorah B'Neviim. Says the Ramban, look carefully, there isn't one miracle where there isn't an idea of doing some level of ishtadlus to be b'mayit b'nes. So l'chura, putting the kanim in between the breads, these shelves, this is probably the being b'mayit b'nes that related to this nes, albeit this nes gadol. Regardless, zok the Gemara vaitis. Again, we're in the middle of discussing Rabbi Yechanan's halach. Rabbi Yechanan had a riot from a pasuk in Parshas Emor that the shulchan is referred to as a shulchan atar, michal de ketuma, you see that the shulchan was able to be mekabel tuma. And Rabbi Yechon was bothered that how was it mekabel tuma? The shulchan was made out of wood. And being that it was made out of wood, it has a din of pshute klietz, flat piece of wood. A flat piece of wood is not mekabel tumah. Say if the miskeres was lamaila, I understand. But if the miskeres was lamata, then what's the pshat? Elamai said, Rabbi Yochanan l'chura, you'd have a raya from this sugya that a tavla hamishapeches, a tavla that can be flipped, is also going to be mekabel tumah. Incidentally, we explained the Gemara based on Rabbeinu Tam's pshat. There's a long place over here that brings a pshat from Rabbeinu Tam. That's the way we explain the Gemara. If you take a look at Rashi actually says a different pshat of the Gemara. But regardless, time of the Gemara, I don't understand Rabbi Yochanan anyways, because l'chayra, if it was made out of wood, which is what it was made out of, it's klietz ha'asui lenachas. Klietz ha'asui lenachas is not mekabel tumah. The Gemara answered that it wasn't asui lenachas because they were metaltal when the Yidden used to come to be oiler regal. But the bottom line is that this whole sugya, this whole Amid Gemara, is all predicated on the fact that the shulchan is wood. Freit the Gemara, is that true? The shulchan at its core was wood, but it was coated with gold. So why don't we say that although at its core the shulchan was made out of wood, but being that it was coated with gold, we should look at it as zahav. We should look at it as matches. And all these halachas, the fact that when it's pshute klietz, it's not mekabel tumah, the fact that when it's asul lenachas, it's not mekabel tumah, these are all halachas in wood. But being that this was covered with zahav, it was covered with gold, so why are we treating it as wood? Maybe we should treat it as gold. Miloi tanan, isn't it a mefurish Mishnah? Where's this Mishnah? If it doesn't sound familiar, it's in the 22nd parak of Masechtas Kelim. HaShulchan ve'adol beki, a table or a tree or a chair shed nifchasu, that either got chopped up, or it was covered with marble, and there's a little bit of wood, a little bit of this wooden table or chair left over, enough that you could put a glass, a glazel. So the halach is tamein, it's still tamei, meaning once a keli loses its status as keli, even if it was previously tamei, it's no longer tamei. Right? If a keli is tamei and now it's not a keli anymore, it's nifcha, something happens to it, it's not a keli. So the question over here is this wooden table, for example, got chopped into pieces. And the question is, it's literally hanging by a thread. Is it still a keli? Is it still a table? It still has tumah? Or maybe no. Maybe it loses its tumah. So if there's enough space that you could put a cup there, it's considered tumah. Yehuda says, makam anachas chatichas. No, you have to have a whole meal over there. That's the place you can put a little bread and a side dish. As long as you can put a suda there, that would be enough for it to be makabel tumah. But what do you see from here? Shir in loy shir loy. You want two examples of how the keli would no longer be a keli. How this wooden table would no longer be treated as a wooden table, thus it would lose its tumah. Either it got chopped up or it was coated. So what do you see from here? That when you coat something, it takes on a new status. If that's the case, the shulchan, which was wood, once it was coated with gold, you should look at it as a kli matches. That's the Gemara's kasha. V'chitayim says the Gemara. Maybe you're going to tell me, maybe there's a difference between a coating where you literally nail the coating into the actual word versus a coating which is a more superficial coating. And based on that, you'll tell me that Mishnah Masechtas Kelim is talking about where they plated it in a more significant way. Whereas the Shulchan was just plated more superficially with gold. As a result, it retained its status as a wooden keli. But the Gemara says it's not true because Rish Lakish asked this precise question to Rabbi Yochanan. That Mishnah that talks about a keli being plated and losing its status of tumah, is it if it's oimed only, or even if it's any oimed? Does it have to be literally banged in, or even if it's not? Another question he asked him, does the rim of the table have to be covered as well? What if the rim wasn't covered? Does that make a difference? Rabbi Yochanan told him, it doesn't matter if it was hacked in or if it wasn't hacked in. It doesn't matter if the rim was covered or wasn't covered. The halacha always is that once you coat a keli, it takes on a new status. Again, and the shulchan wasn't, it was coated with gold, but it wasn't nailed in, but you see it doesn't really matter. So again, why are we treating the shulchan as a klietz? It's anyways not a klietz, it's a kli matches because of the fact that it was coated with gold. It says the Gemara, maybe you can tell me a different teretz. You're going to tell me that the shulchan wasn't made out of ordinary wood, it was made out of atzei shitin. And atzei shitin is very precious, very chashuv. So being that it's very chashuv, maybe it doesn't become bottle even to gold. wood ordinarily becomes bottled to whatever covers it. But Atzei Shitim is so valuable, maybe that's different. But the Gemara says, that's all good according to Reish Lakish, who said, that Mishnah Masechtas Kelim is talking dafka about wood such as achsilgus wood, which is an inferior quality wood. It's not chashav, thus it becomes bottled to whatever's covering it. Kli mismas. But if it's a more chashav, it doesn't become bottle, shaper, then it's very good. That's the answer. Atzei Shitim is like kli mismas, and as a result, it doesn't become bottle to the gold. That's why it's kliyes. Ella the Rabbi Yochanan, but who is the one that said and commented on the Shulchan? It was Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan l'shitaso said, Kli mismas nami batli, that even chashav wood becomes bottle. So why was Rabbi Yochanan treating the Shulchan in the first place as a kliyetz? Should he not have treated it as kli matches? Says the Gemara, Gishmak Teretz. Shani Shulchan, you have to say that the Shulchan is different. The Rachmana Kari Eitz. Because even though it's true, Shulchan was made out of eitz, it was covered with gold, and in halacha, as in Hilchas Tumah V'Taira, as in the 22nd parak of Masechtas Kelim, we should look at it not as a wooden keli, we should look at it as a golden keli. But this is different. Here there's a pasuk in Yecheskel, and the pasuk clearly refers to the Shulchan as a wooden keli. Shenemar hamizbeach eitz shalish amos gavaya va'arkei shtayim amos umiktza'os of loy va'arkei v'kirois of eitz. This is the second time it says eitz. Vayidaber elai zeh hashulchan ashel lefnei Hashem. So the pasuk of his is referring to the mizbeach and the Shulchan, as we'll see in a moment, and the Torah refers to it as a keli that was made out of eitz. So at the end of the day, it's true, it was covered with gold, but being that Rachmana Kari eitz, therefore in halacha, from a tumah perspective, we look at it not as a klizah, but rather as a kli eitz. The Gemara asks that we mentioned this pasuk in Yecheskel, so b'derech agav, the pasuk starts off talking about the mizbeach, and then it talks about the Shulchan, right? Hamizbeach, eight shalish amos gavay va'arkei shtayim amos umiktzais of lei va'arkei v'kirois of eitz vayidaber elai zeh hashulchan ashel lefnei Hashem pasach b'mizbeach v'sayim b'shulchan, says the Gemara Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Elazar Dami Travay bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim mizbeach mechaper l'adam. When there was a beis hamikdash, the mizbeach was mechaper. A yid would bring a carbon. Depending on the carbon, that's the kapara he got. But a carbon was always mechaper. But now that we don't have a beis hamikdash, so how do you get kapara? Shulchan shel adam mechaper. The person's shulchan can be mechaper. So you want to know why the pasuk uses the word shulchan, referring to the mizbeach? We're somehow interchanging mizbeach and shulchan. We don't mean the shulchan. We're talking about every yid's personal shulchan. That once upon a time you needed the mizbeach to be mechaper, but va'achshav she'ei beis hamikdash kayim shulchan shel adam mechaper. A person can get kapara through a shulchan. How do you get kapara by a shulchan? So Rashi says the noisein prutalani, that if a person gives food, he gives something to an ani, that's the way that he gets kapara. Taisa says the same thing. Taisa sends you to a Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's not daf chof gimel, it's daf kuf gimel. It's a Gemara parak chelik where the Gemara says gedolah v'gima. The Gemara talks about the chashivos of achnasas archim, the chashivos of shearing and giving tzedakah. That again, through a person's shulchan, you invite archim, aniyim, to your house, you sit down at your table and you mechaber them and you do chesed. That shulchan is mechaper in the same exact way, that the mizbeach once upon a time was mechaper. My good friend Levi Chomsky showed me a Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshas Truma, where Rabbeinu Bechaya brings this Gemara and he says two dvarim nefla. Number one, he says that the shulchan was made up of atzi shitin. Why atzi shitin? Says Rabbeinu Bechaya, the word shitin is an acronym. It's Rosh Tevos, Shalom, Toiva, Yeshua, and Mechila. That through the shulchan, a person got Shin, which is Shalom, Tes, which is Toiva, Yud, which is Yeshua, it's worth repeating this, and Mem, which is Mechila. And what's the beer advarim? Says Rabbeinu Bechaya. The beer is because the shulchan is a mizbeach kapara la'adam. Va'alechem shala shulchan hu chashiv to carbon al gabi ha-mizbeach. Kisha adam toiv ayim meitev hu meichel shamaniyim. V'hu shedarshu azal. Ha-mizbeach eight shalish amos v'yedabri la'azal shulchan shnei Hashem. Pasach b'mizbeach v'zayich b'shulchan, he brings our Gemara. So you see from our Gemara the power of a shulchan. And again, not the shulchan the Mishkan too, but every person's individual shulchan. Every shulchan is atzei shitim. Your dining room table is atzei shitim. How so? Shitim is shalom, it's toiva, it's Yeshua, and mechila. Then Rabbeinu Bechai says something else. He says, uminik chasidim shebet Tzarfas. He heard that the chasidim in Tzarfas, the Anshe Maisa, that were living in France, sha'oisem meshulchanim aron l'kfura. They had a minig that they would make from their aroin that they were buried in, they would make it from their shulchan. And the reason they did it was to show that a person, when he goes into the next world, all his money and everything that he amassed and accumulated during his lifetime, he's not going to take it with him. It's only the tzedakah that he did while he was alive. That's the only thing that he's going to take. And the toiva that he was meitiv on his shulchan, that's what he's going to be able to take along with him. So says Rabbeinu Bachya, based on this idea that the shulchan is shalom toiva yeshua mechila, that the shulchan has this unbelievable kayach. And you see the schos that a person has when he's meitiv al shulchan. It was for that reason that the minig of the chassidim in Sarfas was shayu oisem mishulchanam aron lekfura. Reb Shai Karastir wrote in his Tava, incidentally, that he wanted his aron to be made out of the shulchan. But it's a makar right here. It's a makar. It's a Rabbeinu Bachya goes to the Rishonim in Parashas Truma. Levi told me two stories. One with the Taz. They said that there was a woman that had a tremendous yeshua from the Taz. The Taz davened for a woman, and she had a tremendous yeshua, and she had a karas hatoiv to the Taz. So she decided that she's going to buy the Taz a new talis. What do you buy the Taz? So she bought the Taz a talis. So she comes to the Taz, and the Taz said, "I can't take it. I'm sorry, but I can't take it." And he said that even though his talis is old and it's not muhudder maybe, but he said his talis that he has is going to say edus for him one day for all the tefillos that he davened, and he wants to continue to daven with this talis. He wants to be buried with this talis. So could see edus b'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The other story he told me is that after Meir Simcha was nifter, the Rogatchover Goyen, so Meir Simcha and the Rogatchover, they were both Rabbanim in the same city. Right? Meir Simcha was a Litvisher Rav in Dvinsk, and the Tzafnas Panech, the Rogatchover Goyen, was the Chassidish Rav in Dvinsk. But either way, Meir Simcha was nifter first, and after Meir Simcha passed away, the Rogatchover Goyen said that you should take Meir Simcha Stender, and you should make the Arum for a Meir Simcha Stender. But again, these are Meiselach, anecdotes, but really the source of it is a Rabbeinu Bachaya, Uminik Chasidim Shebetzarfas, She'oisem Mishulchanim Arum Lekfor. Again, what's the significance of the Shulchan, a person's table? Because that's where he does chesed, that's where he's machnas oirech, that's where he has achnasas archem, and it's for that reason, that's what he's supposed to do. Take a look at the Marsha in this Gemara. The Marsha says, I think maybe there's another pshat over here, based on a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It's Perek Gimel Mishnah Dal. Reb Shimon Omer, Shloisha she'achlu al shulchan echad, 3 people that sit together and they eat at one table. V'lei amru all of divrei Torah, and they don't talk in learning. Ki'ilu achlu mizivchei mesim. Shenemar ki chol shulchanos malu kit soya b'li makom. Avos shloisha she'achlu al shulchan echad. V'amru all of divrei Torah, but 3 people are sitting on a shulchan, and they do say divrei Torah ki'ilu achlu mishulchanos al makom. It's as if they're eating from the shulchan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shenemar vayidaber elai zeh hashulchan asher lefnei Hashem. Says the Marsha. Take a look at that Mishnah, and I think that's pshat in this Gemara. What does the Marsha mean? It's pasha what he means. What does it mean ki'ilu achlu mishulchanos al makom? We know the Gemara says kayhanim mishulchan gavaya kazachu. The Mizbeach is referred to Shulchan Shamakim. When the Kohen would put the chalavim and the imurim on the Mizbeach, the Torah refers to it as achila. B'shtei achila is hakasim medaber. Echad achilas adam, ve'echad achilas mizbeach. The Kohanim, when they ate, it was mishulchan gavaya kazachu. They were eating mishulchan shamakim. Shulchan shamakim is the mizbeach. Shloisha she'achlu al shulchan echad. Va'amru al of divrei Torah. It's mizbeach. It's ki'ilu achlu mishulchan shamakim. They just created a mizbeach. They have the mizbeach. The mizbeach's tachlis is it's mechaper. Zokta Marsha that rule divrei Rashi v'Tosfos. I would think it'd be a beautiful pshat in this Gemara. What did the Gemara say? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Amir Travayu. Bizman she'Beis Hamikdash Kayim. When there was a Beis Hamikdash, mizbeach mechaper al adam. But v'achshav she'ein Beis Hamikdash Kayim. Now that there's no Beis Hamikdash, shulchan shel adam mechaper al. But the Gemara is very sasam. What does it mean? The shulchan is mechaper. So Rashi and Tosfos both said, if you do achnasas archim, you're going to get kapar. It's the mitzvah of chesed. It's the mitzvah of achnasas archim. Says the Marsha. I don't think you have to say that. It's a Mishnah. You know what it means when you learn Torah on your shulchan. What does the Mishnah say in Avos? It's ki'ilu achlu mishulchan shamakayim. If it's ki'ilu achlu mishulchan shamakayim, it's based on that a person, regardless, if a person learns Torah at a shulchan and he's machnes Torah, he does chesed on a shulchan, there's nothing to talk about. The shulchan one day will say edus on a person, and that's as it relates to one day. But on this world, the person shulchan, says Rabbeinu Bechaya, was made up of atzish. The shulchan in the Beis Hamidrash was made up of atzish shitin. Every shulchan has the qualities of atzish shitin. What's shitin? It's shalom. It brings peace. It brings taiva. It brings yeshias. It brings mechila.